A thick morning mist clung to the treetops in Normandy, France, on the 19th of August, 1944. Dawn was breaking, and inside the M4 Valiant tank, every breath sounded like a drumbeat. For the last 10 minutes, Sergeant Leo Vance, 25 years old and hailing from Peoria, Illinois, had been staring into a strange-looking device. It wasn't standard issue. In fact, it looked more like a science fair project. A long, slender optical tube bolted at a bizarre angle to the turret hatch. Just yesterday, his crew had been making jokes about it. They called it Vance's Folly. But right now, in this moment, nobody was laughing. Leo was stone still as he whispered into the intercom. "Hold steady. He's out there, somewhere near the orchard line." His tank sat silent in a ditch off a narrow forest path, not far from the village of Villeneuve-sur-Forêt. The Americans had intelligence that a German Reaper was moving somewhere in this sector, one of the most feared tanks the Wehrmacht had unleashed in northern France. In the cramped, steel gut of the Valiant, the air was thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and a silence that hummed with nerves. Corporal Mac Riley, the driver, gripped the control levers like they were lifelines. Sam Peterson, the gunner, kept one hand on the elevation wheel and the other on the firing trigger. Ralph "Moose" Galloway, the loader, cradled a 75mm high-explosive round like a newborn child. And then Leo saw it. A flicker, a glint of metal moving behind the hedgerow, barely visible through the inverted lens of his homemade periscope. Not headlights, not infantry. No, this was different. "Something bigger," he whispered again. "Target, 3 o'clock. It's a Reaper." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The Reaper, officially the Panzerkampfwagen 5, was faster, better armored, and carried a main gun that could punch through a Valiant like a tin can from over 1,000 yards away. Leo knew the math. Everyone in this tank knew the math. But nobody flinched. Because Leo's invention, the very thing they'd been laughing about for days, had just given them the one thing every tanker prays for before a fight. The first shot. He pulled back from the eyepiece, his voice steady. "Doc, fire on my mark. Moose, stay down. Mac, kill the engine." He paused, listening, counting the seconds against the rustle of leaves. Then, in a voice barely louder than the forest breathing around them, he said, "Fire!" That oddball from Illinois, before he was Sergeant Vance, tank commander for Bravo Company's 2nd Platoon, 88th Armored Regiment, Leo Eugene Vance was just a lanky kid from the factory district of Peoria, Illinois. Born in 1921, raised by a widowed mother and 2 older sisters, Leo spent more time with scrap metal and busted radios than he did with other kids. By 16, he could build a working carburetor out of lawnmower parts. By 18, he'd rigged a telescope to a rifle scope just to see if he could. His high school principal once wrote in his file, "A keen imagination, stubborn, and allergic to the standard way of doing things. A bright mind, poorly suited for rules." When the war came to America after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, Leo didn't hesitate. He enlisted the very next day, not out of patriotism, he'd later admit, but because he was bored. "I figured if I was ever going to die," he once told a friend, "I'd rather die moving than standing still." Basic training didn't care for him, and the feeling was mutual. He questioned orders, modified his gear without permission, and once rigged his bunk to lift like a drawbridge to avoid late-night inspections. But there was something sharp and unorthodox in his thinking that made him stand out. The Army, not sure what to do with him, eventually sent him to armor school at Fort Knox, Kentucky. It was there he met his crew. Mac Riley, the hotshot driver from Buffalo, New York. Sam "Doc" Peterson, the gunner, a former physics teacher. And Ralph "Moose" Galloway, a loader who stood 6'3", weighed 250 pounds, and had once decked a mule in a tavern brawl. They called themselves the Spectre of Bravo, a nickname that started as a joke about their ability to vanish off the radar during training exercises and somehow reappear exactly where they were needed. But Leo made sure they lived up to the name. Under him, they didn't fight loud. They fought smart. By the time they landed in Normandy in late July 1944, nearly 2 months after D-Day, Leo had already earned a reputation. Part mechanic, part mad scientist, and 100% dedicated to keeping his crew alive. He had a rule. If it gives us an edge and doesn't blow up in our faces, we're trying it. His men didn't always understand his ideas. But they followed him, right up until the day he introduced them to the inverted periscope. That's when they started to wonder if Leo had finally lost his mind. To understand why Leo Vance was so obsessed with finding a Reaper before it found him, you have to understand what it meant to face one. On paper, it wasn't a fight. It was an execution. The American M4 Valiant, Leo's tank, was officially classified as a medium tank. Weighing about 33 tons and armed with a 75mm main gun, it was fast, reliable, and built as tough as a Ford pickup truck. This was no accident. It was literally designed for mass production. By the end of the war, the United States had built over 50,000 Valiants. The strategy was numbers. But in a one-on-one duel, the Valiant was painfully outmatched. The German Reaper, the Panzerkampfwagen 5, was also technically a medium tank, but the German definition of the term was something else entirely. The Reaper weighed nearly 45 tons. It carried a long-barreled 75mm cannon that could tear a Valiant to pieces from over 1,000 yards away. Its front armor was sloped and thick, up to 80mm of it, making it nearly invulnerable from the front. Its optics were sharper. Its gun had more range. It was a sniper rifle in the body of a tank. For valiant crews like Leo's, the Reaper wasn't just another tank. It was a predator. American doctrine reflected that brutal reality. Valiants were taught to flank Reapers, swarm them, or avoid them altogether if they didn't have artillery or air support. A head-on attack was suicide. Leo knew it. Everyone in the Spectre of Bravo knew it. They'd seen the burned-out husks of other Valiants on the sides of the roads, still smoking, their hatches blown open and turrets peeled back like can lids. In a tank-on-tank fight, the Reapers were the harvesters, silent, sudden, and final. But the Reaper wasn't perfect. It was heavy, almost too heavy. Its complex suspension and transmission often failed in rough terrain, especially in the woods and hills of Normandy. It was clumsy to maneuver. Its turret turned slower. Its supply lines were stretched, and most importantly, there just weren't enough of them. The Germans built less than 6,000 Reapers in the entire war. It was a beast, yes, but it was a rare beast. And that was the weakness Leo focused on. "You don't outgun a Reaper," he once told his crew. "But if you can outsmart it just once, you won't need a second shot." So, while other tank commanders relied on speed or brute force, Leo built his odds differently. He built them on foresight, on geometry, on field modifications that other men laughed at. Sandbags for armor, engine mufflers for stealth, and yes, an upside-down periscope. Because in a war where seconds could save your life, seeing first meant everything. The crazy idea, the inverted periscope, came to Leo in the quiet hours between orders. In those strange, restless moments when the fighting stopped, but the fear didn't. They were parked near an old barn outside Le Béni-Bocage, France, fixing a throne track for the third time in a week. The sun was setting, casting long orange shadows across the fields, and that's when Leo saw it. A broken German field scope, half buried in the mud at the edge of the woods, probably abandoned in the chaos of a retreat. The housing was cracked, but the optics still worked. He turned it over in his hands, studying the angles inside. An idea sparked in his head like a firecracker. What if you put the lens on backward, back at camp, using leftover brackets, a rubber tube from a busted fuel line, and part of an antenna from a downed Luftwaffe plane? Leo began assembling something no Valiant had ever used before. A field-rigged, reverse-lens periscope. It was ugly. It was wobbly. But it gave him something no manual, no officer, and no training course could: a new way of looking at the battlefield. Not everyone was impressed. When Leo first showed the crew, Mac burst out laughing. "You're gonna get us all killed with that thing," he said. Moose muttered something about tinfoil hats. And Doc, ever the scholar, asked him point blank, "Leo, why not just stick your head out like a normal person?" Leo didn't answer. He just said, "Because the ones who stick their heads out don't live very long." And he wasn't wrong. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, where thick lines of brush turned every road into a death trap, German snipers and anti-tank crews watched for any movement above a turret. A single moment of carelessness, a single glint of a helmet, could mean certain death. Leo had seen it happen. But upstairs, nobody seemed interested in his solution. When he asked for official permission to mount the periscope, his CO supposedly shook his head and said, "This isn't a science fair, Vance. Stick to the book." Leo didn't. Over the next few days, he quietly reinforced the device using bolts from a wrecked Jeep and added a rubber gasket to stabilize the view. He recalibrated the mirror's angle to match the turret's slope and designed a swivel that let him scan without moving the tank. It wasn't perfect. The image was upside down, and it gave you a headache if you looked for too long. But it worked. And more importantly, it kept him alive. The idea might have been crazy, but it was born from a cold, simple calculation. In tank warfare, the man who sees first usually shoots first, and the man who shoots first usually walks away. Still, the jokes didn't stop. A crew from another platoon called it Leo's fancy toilet paper roll. Another accused him of wasting time when he should be checking fuel lines. Even his own men, loyal as they weren't sure if the contraption would ever be useful in a real fight. But Leo believed in it. Not because it was elegant, not because it was approved, but because if it gave his crew a 5-second advantage, it could be the difference between driving home in a Valiant and being shipped home in a box. By mid-August of 1944, the hedgerow hell of Normandy was thinning out. The Americans were pushing east. The Germans were retreating, but nothing was certain. Every town they took cost them men. Every forest they entered could be their last. And it was in one of those forests, on the outskirts of Villeneuve-sur-Forêt, that Leo's unorthodox invention was about to have its moment. The day started like any other. Engine checks, refueling, lukewarm rations, and the constant, low-grade hum of anxiety. Around noon, a runner from battalion headquarters arrived with new intelligence. The message was short, but chilling. German armor, believed to be Reaper class, spotted operating near Route C-12. Estimate 2 vehicles, moving east, well camouflaged, possible counterattack. The coordinates put them less than 3 miles from the Spectre of Bravo's position. That night, under a pale half-moon and the dull thud of distant artillery, Leo's platoon was ordered to take up a covering position at a forest junction north of the town. Their job was to stop any enemy armor from slipping south and disrupting a key American supply column. It was supposed to be routine. But there's no such thing as routine in a war. Leo picked the spot himself. A narrow track that cut through the deep woods and opened into a small clearing bordered by an abandoned orchard. The trees gave them natural cover. The track gave them a choke point. And the orchard, it gave them a perfect field of fire. He positioned the Spectre of Bravo in a shallow depression, tucked between 2 hedgerows. They cut the engine, went to whisper mode, and checked the gun again and again. No fires, no lights, no talking. For 5 hours, they waited in silence. And in that silence, something strange happened. The kind of moment that only happens when war presses in on all sides. The jokes stopped. The doubts went quiet. Even the toilet paper roll nickname was forgotten. Everyone in that tank, consciously or not, started looking at the strange device mounted in their turret, not with ridicule, but with hope. Leo used it like a violinist tunes an instrument. Slow sweeps, gentle shifts, scanning the tree line. Every 30 seconds he'd pause to recalibrate the optics. Every 10 minutes, he'd wipe the lens with the corner of his sleeve. His crew was silent, but they were watching him. And somehow, in the soft red light inside the tank, the device didn't look silly anymore. It looked necessary. At around 4 in the morning, Leo froze, holding his breath. A shadow of movement just past the orchard. Not the blurry shape of an infantryman, not the lurch of a supply truck. This was different, low, deliberate, methodical. Through the inverted lens of his periscope, he saw it. The faint glint of a German tank's observation scope moving between the trees. A Reaper, less than 200 yards away, was creeping through the woods, its turret slowly scanning from side to side. Leo whispered, "Reaper, 2 o'clock, hold steady." In most tanks, this is when panic sets in. Someone yells, someone gets trigger happy, someone opens a hatch too soon. Not in the Spectre of Bravo. They had drilled for this. Leo had trained them for this exact moment. Mac killed the ignition. Sam brought the gun around slowly, smoothly. Moose chambered an armor-piercing round and locked it in. Leo kept his eyes on the target. The Reaper moved to the edge of the track. It hadn't seen them. Not yet. It was turning, exposing its side armor. Another foot, and it would be behind another line of trees. Leo had seconds to decide. If they fired and missed, the Reaper would fire back. And at this range, the Valiant's armor was paper-thin. But if they waited, the opportunity would be gone. Leo's voice cut through the silence. "Doc, you're on target. Fire!" the Valiant roared. The 75mm shell screamed across the clearing and slammed into the Reaper's midsection. A flash, a puff of smoke, and then silence. No explosion. No return fire. Leo yelled, "Reload!" Moose slammed another round home. Sam fired again. This time, the shell hit the turret ring. The Reaper jolted. A flicker of flame shot out of the top hatch. Its engine revved, then choked. 30 seconds later, it was over. A quiet fell over the battlefield. The kind of quiet where it feels like the world itself is holding its breath. No engine hum, no footsteps, just the slow, settling groan of cooling metal and the distant crackle of something burning. Inside the Valiant, no one spoke. Not because they were calm, but because their bodies hadn't yet caught up to what their minds already knew. They got it. They got the Reaper. Leo blinked a few times, his eyes still locked on the wreckage through the hazy lens of his homemade scope. The smoke was drifting away on the morning breeze now, and the German tank's outline was becoming clearer. It sat, awkwardly, like a beast caught mid-stride, frozen by death. Its right track was blown clean off, and half its turret was blackened by fire. One hatch was open and swinging slightly, as if the crew had tried to get out but didn't make it. Sam spoke first. "Holy hell," he whispered. "We actually did it." Leo didn't respond. He just watched. Not with pride yet. With something heavier. He'd seen Reapers before. He'd seen them reduce friendly tanks to scrap with 2 or 3 clean shots. He'd seen the aftermath. The burned-out holes, the charred bodies, the turrets ripped inside out. But this was the first time he'd seen one fall by his own hand. Ralph Moose Galloway took off his helmet and ran a trembling hand through his hair. He was usually the jokester, the one with a wisecrack for every occasion. But even he couldn't find the words. Mac, the driver, reached out and gently touched the dashboard, as if it had saved them out of sheer loyalty. Leo finally pulled his eyes away from the periscope. "Reload," he said quietly. "Sir," Moose asked, "we only saw the one." "Doesn't mean there isn't another." Moose nodded silently and began to chamber another armor-piercing round. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20, but nothing happened. Only the light grew brighter, the smoke thinned, and the shape of their prize became clearer. And it was in those minutes that the crew began to process what had happened. Not just as soldiers, but as men. The Reaper wasn't just a tank. It was a symbol, a myth, a death sentence that rolled on treads and wore a black cross on its side. To kill one was more than a tactical victory. It was personal. It was proof that the stories could be wrong. That maybe, just maybe, the guy with the weird invention, the one everyone laughed at, maybe he saw something the rest of them didn't. Leo didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just slowly and carefully opened the top hatch, and then he pulled himself halfway out into the morning light. What he saw took his breath away. The Reaper wasn't alone. About 40 yards behind it, half hidden under a camouflage net and tree branches, was a second tank. Another Reaper, motionless, abandoned. Its crew must have fled when the first one was hit. Maybe they thought it was an ambush. Maybe they didn't want to die in an iron box like the other guys. Either way, they were long gone. Leo dropped back down and motioned for the rest of the crew to come out. One by one, they climbed out, surveying the scene with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The first Reaper's main gun was still pointed in their direction, a silent threat that would never be fulfilled. Mac knelt by the wreckage, looked back at the others and said, "I can't believe that was real." Sam ran a hand along the side of the Valiant. "You know what saved us?" he asked. They all knew the answer. Leo's periscope. The thing they had mocked. The thing they had dismissed as another one of his quirks. That ridiculous-looking contraption had seen the Reaper before the Reaper saw them. It had let them aim first. Fire first. Survive. Leo didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't have to. Instead, he just muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Seeing first wins wars. Later that day, an intelligence team from battalion headquarters arrived to assess the situation. When they saw the Reaper, still smoking, and the Valiant that had killed it, they asked the same question everyone else would later ask. How? The crew didn't explain, not fully. They just shrugged and said, "We got lucky." But inside the Spectre of Bravo, they knew luck had nothing to do with it. It was geometry and training and nerve, and a guy who refused to listen when he was told his idea was stupid. The tank hadn't beaten the Reaper. The man who wouldn't stop thinking had. By the time the sun had burned through the canopy, the news was already spreading. A single Valiant had taken out a Reaper. No artillery, no air support, no lucky flank. Just 5 men, 1 shot, and something nobody had ever seen before. The Spectre of Bravo wasn't just a call sign anymore. It was a story. The recovery crew that came later that day took pictures, not just of the Reaper's wreckage, but of the Valiant that did the job. Its nose was still stained with soot. Its tracks were caked with dried mud. But the crew, they stood tall for the photo, grime on their faces, helmets pushed back on their heads, and expressions you couldn't quite read. Later, in a makeshift briefing tent a few miles from the front, the battalion commander asked Leo to explain how they did it. Leo didn't give a lecture. He didn't draw a diagram. He just pulled the periscope out of his tank, set it on the folding table, and said, "With this." The room went quiet. One officer leaned in and muttered, "That's homemade." Leo nodded. The commander stared at the device. Mismatched bits of metal, scorch marks on the side, the lenses slightly warped from vibration. It looked more like a plumbing accident than a piece of military hardware. But it had worked, and you couldn't argue with results. There was no official award, at least not right away. The Army wasn't always quick to celebrate ingenuity that broke protocol. But in the barracks, around the campfires, in the nervous laughter between artillery barrages, Leo's name started to come up. Some called him the Mad Mechanic. Others called him Doc Frankenstein. But to most, especially in his platoon, he was just the guy who saw first. And slowly, the tone changed. It wasn't ridicule anymore. It was respect. Crews from other Valiants would come over to ask questions. Could he build another one? What parts did he use? Was it hard to install? Leo showed them what he could, warned them about the headaches from the inverted image, and even offered to help if he had time. One young lieutenant, barely 20, told him, "I used to think all your tinkering was a waste of time. Now I think you're going to outlive all of us." Leo didn't laugh. He just looked down at his hands, grease-stained, calloused, trembling ever so slightly, and said, "I'm not trying to live forever. I'm just trying to see tomorrow." Inside the Spectre of Bravo, the dynamic had changed too. Where there had once been teasing, there was now trust. Moose started calling the periscope Old Reliable. Doc began sketching out plans to improve its field of view. Mac, who once joked about being buried in this coffin on tracks, now checked the optics before he checked the engine. The moment they had all thought was a fluke had become a turning point, not just in their reputation, but in their mentality. They weren't hiding anymore. They were hunting for the next one. That shift, that quiet rewiring of the mind, it's not something you learn in a manual. It only comes from experience, from surviving the impossible, from seeing the unthinkable and realizing that sometimes the crazy guy might be the only sane one in the room. The legend of the Spectre of Bravo grew in the days that followed. Other units joked about installing a Vance scope. One platoon even painted a periscope symbol on the side of their tank as a tribute. Leo never asked for any of it. He didn't want the attention. But the story spread because, in a war defined by mass production, standard issue and assembly line combat, a single homemade invention had changed the outcome of one deadly morning. And everybody knew stories like that don't stay secret for long. The war didn't end in that forest. It went on, mile after bloody mile, town after broken town, until the Allies had pushed through France, crossed the Rhine, and brought Nazi Germany to its knees in May of 1945. But for Leo Vance and the crew of the Spectre of Bravo, something did end in that clearing near the orchard by Villeneuve-sur-Forêt. The fear. They still faced danger every day. They still lost friends. But after that morning, they carried something different into battle. Proof. Proof that they could survive. Proof that the impossible wasn't always impossible. Proof that ideas, even the strange ones, could be weapons. Leo survived the war. So did Mac, Sam, and Moose. They came home in one piece, though none of them ever felt whole again. Leo didn't seek medals or write books. He didn't speak at VFW halls or give interviews. He worked as a mechanic, lived a quiet life, and kept the periscope in a dusty box in his garage. For years, he didn't talk about the war. Not to his family, not to his neighbors, not even to the men who had been in that Valiant with him. But decades later, when his teenage grandson, a history buff, asked him what it was like to go face-to-face with a Reaper and win, Leo finally gave him an answer. He didn't talk about tactics. He didn't talk about killing. He just said, "It's not about killing the monster. It's about not letting the monster make you stop thinking." That is the legacy he left behind. In a war that demanded obedience, Leo chose ingenuity. In a machine built to follow orders, he innovated. And in a world that often values power over cleverness, he proved that sometimes the smallest adjustment, the simplest idea, can save 5 lives and echo through generations. The inverted periscope wasn't revolutionary in its design. It didn't change the course of World War II. It didn't win a campaign. But it changed the fate of 5 men on one cold morning in Normandy. It turned laughter into respect, doubt into action, and fear into resolve. The lesson isn't just a military one. It's a human one. Trust your instincts. Follow your idea, even when people laugh at it. Especially when they laugh. Because progress doesn't always look like a blueprint. Sometimes, it looks like a broken scope, a few bolts from a jeep, and a soldier who refused to stop tinkering, even when death was staring him in the face. There's something quiet and heroic about a person who doesn't wait for permission to do what they think is right. Leo Vance wasn't a general. He wasn't a war hero in the way we usually imagine them. He didn't lead a charge, or plant a flag, or give an inspiring speech set to orchestral music. He was just one man in a steel box in the middle of a forest, trying not to die. But maybe that's where true courage lives. Not in the grand gestures, but in the small, unseen decisions. The decision to fiddle with a broken scope while everyone else is sleeping. The decision to believe in an idea that no one else understands. The decision to trust your gut even when your own crew is rolling their eyes. Leo's story reminds us that innovation doesn't always come from engineers or think tanks. Sometimes it comes from a guy with dirt under his fingernails and too much time on his hands between firefights. Sometimes it's born of necessity, of fear, of desperation, of the burning desire to see one more day. But most profoundly, it reminds us of something else. That every breakthrough in survival, every advantage we gain, doesn't start with strength. It starts with sight. Not just what we see with our eyes, but how we see. The battlefield isn't just out there. It's inside us, between what we're told and what we believe, between the rules and our instincts, between what's expected and what's possible. Leo saved his crew not because he had a better gun. He saved them because he saw first, and because he dared to trust what he saw, even when no one else did. In the end, the Reaper wasn't just a tank. It was a test. And the periscope wasn't just a tool. It was a statement. A statement that thinking differently isn't a flaw. It's a way to survive. So maybe the next time someone scoffs at your idea, dismisses your weird invention, or tells you to stick to the manual, you'll remember Leo Vance, hunched over in the belly of a Valiant, staring into an upside-down scope, and seeing a nightmare before it saw him. And maybe, just maybe, you'll do it anyway. What struck you the most? The Reaper, the periscope, or the fact that one man's crazy idea actually worked? Let me know in the comments below.